Rings of Power and House of the Dragon have a lot in common, and for this reason are inevitably being compared. They're both in the fantasy genre, both works of adaptations from books presented as historical text, where gaps had to be filled. Both come with a lot of expectations from fans. So with all these things in common, why is it one seems to be getting better with every episode, while the other seems to be getting worse? We're around halfway through the first season for both House of the Dragon and Rings of Power, and I'm still watching both. With Hot D, my pleasant surprise, given the low expectations I had following the last season of Game of Thrones, has upgraded to real enjoyment. Seeing the story evolve and the stakes gradually rise in the grand setting of Westeros, and watching the historical characters from Fire and Blood come to life on screen as I begin to invest emotionally in the characters. With Rings of Power, what started as a shaky beginning of slow, uneventful episodes filled with clunky pacing, juvenile dialogue and lackluster characters has, in my view, failed to redeem itself in the episodes that followed, and I really wanted it to. So why is one so far appearing to succeed while the other goes from bad to worse? And not just in my view. Reviews of the show, if you can find a platform that Amazon doesn't own to read them on, are less than encouraging for $1 billion show with an intended 5 seasons, and at worst, utter decimation. Our only hope at this point, assuming things stay pretty much the same for the rest of the season, is that Amazon Studios actually takes on board some of the critiques from fans and builds this into Season 2. Whether you think this is likely or not, I'll leave to your own thinking, considering the level of contempt the studio has shown Tolkien fans. But because I'm the kind of guy who likes whacking my head repeatedly against a wall, I'm going to break down some of the ways House of the Dragon gets it right where Rings of Power is getting it so wrong. Number 1. Story. Raising the stakes. Story pacing and raising the stakes go hand in hand and work together to create drama. Drama can enter a story in all sorts of ways, and many times it's in small things as well as big. But there needs to be clear conflict where the audience understands and cares about the outcome. Not everything has to be about saving the world, but there needs to be consequences to actions. This raises the stakes and builds tension. Until now, House of the Dragon has used its episode to raise the stakes within the House of Targaryen. In episode 1, the conflict comes right away. The Westerosi lords select Prince Viserys over Princess Rhaenys to rule. This sets up one of the main themes of the season, power, and how the Targaryen family will ultimately come to a bloody war in pursuit of it. Will the lives of the Westerosi people be greatly impacted by who sits on the throne? Probably not. The conflict as it stands is contained within the Targaryen family, but that doesn't matter because it has built the tension and we understand the implications for each character concerned. If we compare this to Rings of Power, the first real conflict arises with the other elves when Galadriel is seemingly the only one who thinks Sauron is still a threat. The problem is that it's unclear why Galadriel thinks this, and it's unclear why the other elves don't. It's suggested in a single shot that Galadriel is taking up her brother's mantle after his death. But why? Is she doing it out of grief? Or did Finrod know something the others didn't? Already we have a giant hole in the main conflict that detracts from believability in the story and the agency of its characters. If we don't understand the why, we don't understand the characters' motivations, and if we don't understand something as basic as why they do what they do, how can we care about their journey? What are the stakes if they lose? Yes, we get flashes of Sauron with an army, but what does this mean for Middle-earth, and what does it mean personally for Galadriel? Why should we care whether the others believe her or not? Number 2. Pacing. Slow burn or sluggish? Slow burn is often used to describe a story that has a lot of setup and gradually builds tension that leads to an all-out conclusion. It's also a term used by some writers to try to mask a problem with sluggish pacing. One of the ways to combat the pacing issue and to avoid being sluggish is to think about setup and payoff, not just in the entire story across a season or 5 seasons. Audience want and expect setup and payoff not just in every episode, but in every scene. The level of drama for each setup and payoff will be different, giving highs and lows and a variance to the pace, as well as building tension. But it doesn't change that each episode should feel like the story has moved forward, and this can be done with strategic payoffs. In House of the Dragon, King Viserys banishes his current heir and brother Daemon from King's Landing, and appoints his only living child, Princess Rhaenyra, heir to the Iron Throne. Setup. By episode 2 we see an alliance form between Lord Corlys, Princess Rhaenyra's husband, and Daemon, tipping the scales of power as they together take on the Crab Feeder, who holds the Stepstones, crippling Westerosi shipping lanes. By the end of episode 3 this comes to a head in a stunningly shot battle which includes, of course, dragons. This is the payoff. The payoff is clear. It's pronounced, it's gripping, and it builds layers within the story and keeps the audience watching. Of course, these are big plot points. There are smaller payoffs happening in each scene too. In the Rings of Power, there are considerably fewer payoffs, with the setup taking greater amount of screen time. Galadriel doesn't get a payoff to her "No one believes me" arc until the end of episode 4, when Miriel, after seeing the vision in the Palantir, agrees to Galadriel's request that the Queen Regent and her armies go with her to wage war against the orcs in the Southlands. Until this short scene, we had setup after setup of repetitious scenes. Watching the same scene over and over but with different characters is a certain way to kill your pace as well as the interest of your audience. Number 3. Characters. Don't make people hate them, unless intended. Characters need to be human, even if they're elves, even if they're aliens, even if they're animals. By human I mean three-dimensional, fully realised, or on their way to being fully realised. They should not be two-dimensional planks of wood. But despite how human and gritty you want to make them, there are two things a writer should seldom do. The first is to give their protagonist zero redeeming qualities, make them smug, dislikable, unless of course this is part of the character arc and they're going to start learning some harsh lessons pretty effing quickly. The second is that if people hate a character, it should be because the writer has intended for you to hate that character, and importantly, as a distinction, that character is disliked because of their innate qualities, not because they're badly written. Which brings us to Rings of Power. As one Forbes article headline wrote, Rings of Power has a Galadriel problem, and I would have to agree with that. But rather than turn this into a Galadriel bashing session, let's compare her with a character who has been well established, Princess Rhaenyra. Rhaenyra displays a range of emotion. Galadriel displays a range of contempt. Rhaenyra displays wit. Galadriel displays confusion. Rhaenyra displays strength. Galadriel displays smugness. Rhaenyra displays vulnerability. Galadriel displays stupidity. With little to redeem Galadriel in the eyes of the audience, the writers need to address this issue, and quickly. It's one thing to have a salty character full of piss and vinegar when you humanise them with vulnerabilities. When you make them the bestest ever at everything with a seeming contemptuous ease, but then make them utterly stupid despite having the wisdom of thousands of years of life, it doesn't take a great leap of imagination to decipher why your audience aren't warming to her. We had the Galadriel horse moment, which I know a lot of people found, well, creepy, but I found it to be the singular moment of vulnerability and authentic emotion from this character so far. And what I want from Galadriel, if she can't be the Galadriel from the books, is more of this. Number 4. Know your audience. They're not stupid. This is a big one. Knowing your audience means you can write for them, add elements you'll know they'll enjoy, know what level to take the writing in terms of tone, complexity, and also in areas such as violence and gore. Knowing your audience gives you an indication as to what they expect from the show and how you can give it to them. On the complexity issue, this also includes writing down to your audience, seemingly taking a view that they couldn't possibly comprehend more involved story or remember what's happening, so you'll have to explain everything in painfully simple terms and keep the events sparse and the story arcs minimum as to not confuse the poor lumps. Ah, bless. While House of the Dragon takes up the mantle of Game of Thrones in terms of its political intrigue, and is beginning to set layer upon layer of plot, Rings of Power seems to want to repeat scenes or simply add them to take up time in the episode. House of the Dragon serves violence because it knows its audience not only doesn't mind it, it actually expects it. Rings of Power isn't sure whether to show blood or not, and clearly doesn't know what level of violence to depict because it clearly doesn't know who this show is for. Kids? Adults? Fish fingers? Who knows? House of the Dragon adds small Easter eggs for fans of the books, such as referring to A Song of Ice and Fire, the name of the book series, as the prophetic dream that sees the events in the Game of Thrones. But it also explains the meaning behind this dream for people that haven't read the books. Rings of Power, despite changing the lore and the events set out in the books, drops terms such as Valar and Silmarils without any explanation as to what these are, as if it expects the audience to know, despite the showrunners saying they wanted to attract new fans to the IP. House of the Dragon approaches its allegory faithfully to the books, with A Strand of Fire and Blood tackling the issue of male-only lines of succession. The show does this in a way that doesn't talk down to the audience or dumb down the issue. In Rings of Power, a group of men shouting about one elf coming to take all their jobs is about as subtle as a sledgehammer to the face. Either the writers aren't capable of multifaceted diverse thinking, or they think we're all idiots. Number 5. Writing. Don't be lazy. Writing really encompasses everything I'm talking about in this video. We can say, oh, those special effects could be better, or that costume's a bit crap, but when the writing is on point, at least for me, none of that matters. Bad writing is the reason the Rings of Power's pacing is off, the characters are bland, and why watching it is about as thrilling as a visit to your nan's. But for this point specifically, I want to talk about lazy writing, that type of writing that just makes you roll your eyes, that immediately pulls you out of the fantasy and makes you question everything about the show, including why you're watching it. House of the Dragon puts effort into its character building and its scenes. It doesn't rely on deus ex machina or coincidental shipwrecks to save its characters, and this adds to the realism. The same can't be said for Rings of Power. I've talked about this in a previous video, but when characters can magically teleport distances that would usually take weeks of travel, and they can do it without so much as a single costume change, you're really asking a lot if you want the audience to stay immersed in this world. The same lazy writing can be seen when orcs can or can't go out in the sun based on the convenience of this particular scene. You see a sword take form, but then in the next episode it's inexplicably back to how it was before. In order to make one character appear better than everyone around them, rather than actually make that character better, they just make everyone else worse. The most interesting things happen off-scene, such as a cave-in in the mines, because some writer has decided that rather than witnessing the events unfold, it's better to cut to more inert dialogue. Speaking of dialogue, what characters don't say also matters. Dialogue is the spice of any writing. It has the opportunity to reveal so much when used cleverly. When used as a tool for exposition and on-the-nose monologues, it's just another way for the lazy writer to quiet quit. It's just as important what characters don't say as what they do say. Hot D uses dialogue to both move the story forward as well as build character. Rhaenyra, for example, shows a biting wit in her dialogue that tells us a lot about her as a person. And while we might have a few sit around the table and discuss scenes, there's always conflict within the dialogue, and it's never overly expositive or on the nose. Rings of Power writers seem to be approaching dialogue in the exact opposite way, and this does not make for immersive storytelling. Rather than depict something in a scene, it will simply have a character tell us. Rather than display wit, it has a character inform us when they're trying to be witty. Rather than create meaning, they create the illusion of meaning. Rather than suggestion and subtle foreshadowing, they use on-the-nose dialogue, then try to explain away the overt foreshadowing. But foreshadowing is a tricky creature. If you know it exists, it loses some of its power. All of this serves to create bland scenes, and despite what talent the actors playing these characters might have, only serves to make them appear wooden, two-dimensional caricatures of people, without depth or complexity. But I have to say it's not all bad. I like this shot and the music, and if you're enjoying it, I'm really glad you're enjoying it. The cinematography is fantastic, the directing is great, and yes, sometimes the characters feel disconnected from their backdrops, but on the whole they're really good to look at. The aesthetics feel right. The problem for me, and unfortunately it's a big one and it's one I'm struggling to come to terms with, is the writing. But I'm gonna plug through because I'm still hoping it can be redeemed. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe in all of the usual ways. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy reading.